Welcome to the third and final installment of Almost Banned from the Bible, reading the book of Esther. I come to you from my parents' house in Chico, California, and I'm very glad to see all of you. We began a couple weeks ago by looking at the story of Esther and reconstructing it according to 5 basic elements of plot. The purpose of that will be clear today when we go through and essentially decode this text. By the end of today's discussion, I'm going to show you how I discovered you can unveil the secrets of not only this book, but possibly others in the Bible, but primarily, really Esther, and it has a lot of them. So you will know not only the secrets of Esther, but also the trick that can be used to expose them. So we'll get to that third. But before we get to that, we're going to do a review by looking at the reasons for why this book was almost banned from the Bible. So let's get started. And again, it's really good to see all of you here. I'm excited about today's discussion. And the closet door behind me is falling off, so if it does come down during the discussion, it may well have been an act of God. I don't know, but all right. So last week, again, we discussed reasons for why Esther was almost banned from the Bible. And what I wanted to do was give you, again, a review here of not only who said what, but why they said what. So let's look first at who started the rejection. The initial group was the rabbis. The rabbis debated its inclusion in the emerging canon or standard by which the books of Scripture were judged and determined whether they were in or out. We have evidence in the Talmud, one of the early interpretive works of the Jewish tradition, that of the claim that Esther defiles the hands. And yet we have no specific reason for why this book is so problematic. However, we do know, based on the Talmudic discussion, that the question was asked as to whether this book should have ever even been written down, or whether it should have simply been transmitted from generation to generation orally. So the first group of people who were suspicious of Esther were the rabbis themselves, and it was the rabbis who determined the final formation of the biblical canon between about 90 and 100 of the Common Era. Incidentally, if you want to see evidence in the New Testament for what I'm discussing, you'll notice that Paul and Jesus will often refer to the law and the prophets. How many of you, for how many of you does that sound familiar, that phrasing, law and the prophets, right? The reason they do is that the canon was still in formation. So the writings, the third chunk of the Old Testament that includes things like the Psalms, the book of Job, Ecclesiastes, etc., those were still being considered when Jesus and Paul were alive. Hence why they refer to the first 2/3 of the book only that had been set down and established as, you might say, biblical or holy writ. So that gives us evidence right there, which I always find super fascinating. All right, next we know that after Esther was written in the Hebrew, it was translated into which language? Anybody's guess?
Greek.
Greek is correct. So there were Jews beginning in the 3rd century before Christ that started to translate the Hebrew into Greek because they were living in Egypt, and the language of Egypt, thanks to Alexander the Great, was Greek. So we have Greek additions to the Bible, both in terms of additional books, as well as in the case of Esther, additions to the manuscript itself. So that Esther, which in our Bibles goes back to the Hebrew version, is 10 chapters. In the Greek version, it's 14 chapters. And among other things, they added prayers from Esther and Mordecai, presumably because of the original text's theological deficiencies. So this text is already controversial even before we get to the time of Jesus and after, which I don't know about you, but I'm immediately interested when I hear these kinds of things. I want to know why, right? So we have Greek expansions of the Hebrew text. Third, we talked about the Essenes. What do you remember about the Essenes and their attitude toward Esther? So who can tell us first who the Essenes were? Anybody know? Any guesses? So the Essenes were a semi-monastic community of Jews who were sectarian. They lived out in the desert. One of their members was a certain Ben Obi-Wan Kenobi, but among others, we actually don't have. We have a lot of references in the text to apocalyptic figures like and groups like the Children of Light and the Children of Darkness. So the Essenes were an apocalyptic, semi-monastic, sectarian group who lived outside of Jerusalem in the desert. And in 1947, a very special discovery was made of writings they had stored. What was that discovery?
The Dead Sea Scrolls.
The Dead Sea Scrolls, exactly. They were found in caves sprinkled along the, I forget which sea, but they were found, I think it's the Dead Sea. But anyways, they were found in caves, and they found the entire canon, the entire Hebrew canon, except one book. And you can guess what it was. Esther. So Esther didn't make it into what I would call the greatest hits of spiritual literature that the Essenes had collected and eventually stored in these caves that preserved them for 2,000 years. So why no Esther scroll at Qumran, where the scrolls were discovered? There seems to be no broad consensus here, but several suggestions have been made. One of them is that the Essenes were a bit reluctant to appropriate all holidays. And the holiday they didn't appropriate was Purim. And the Esther story gives an explanation of the event upon which Purim is supposedly based. In Purim, there is an understanding that anything goes. I guess you could think of it as kind of a wild party for the Jews celebrating their survival and their escape of near genocide from the Persians. So it could well be the celebratory the celebratory nature of Purim that caused the Essenes to leave the book out. But in the end, we do not know. Now, not only were the Jews suspicious of this book, we know, as you recall from last week, that not a single New Testament author quoted it. So that's 27 books and over 8,000 verses, and not one of those refers to Esther, not even indirectly. So the book was never quoted by a New Testament author. That right there is a red flag. Something really interesting is going on here. We know that some of the early Christian canons, so again, a canon is a list of established books deemed sacred by the religious group in question. Again, I like to think of it as the greatest hits of spiritual literature according to that book, or a playlist, or a mixtape, or whatever. The idea is that groups collect the texts that are most important to them. And what we have is indication that some early Christian canon lists also excluded Esther. So now things are getting really juicy. Not only have a number of Jews, rabbis, as well as the Essenes, who had either challenged the book's inclusion or simply left it out of their collections. We also have Christians responding in a negative fashion, not quoting it in the New Testament, and in some cases excluding it from early canon lists. Now here's one for free. Do you know when the New Testament and its 27 books was finally deemed canonical by the emerging Catholic Church? This one's quite a stunner. It was the earliest evidence we have of the 27 books we now consider authoritative, inspired, however you want to look at it, is in 367 from an Easter letter put together by a saint named Athanasius, who is considered the father of the canon. And what Athanasius did was essentially establish once and for all what would now be called the New Testament. And up until that point, there's a really neat process that takes place. Paul's letters were the first to be considered authoritative. That's around the end of the 1st century. There is a theory that a man named Essenes gathered Paul's letters out of gratitude for what Paul did to him. Does anybody recall what Paul did for Essenes? According to the book of Philemon in the New Testament. He freed him. Yeah, exactly. Essenes was a slave. His name in Greek means useless, which I probably should have been named, at least during my teenage years as well, according to my mother, who was listening in yesterday on my confirmation class. I've asked her to stay out of this discussion because she kept interrupting. But anyway, I was like, Mom, please, I'm trying to teach a class here. But useless was his name. Paul freed him, and there is reference to a leader of the early church named Onesimus, who at the end of the 1st century could have been the one out of gratitude to gather together Paul's letters. After Onesimus and the Pauline letter adoption, we have the first 4 Gospels. Those were about mid 2nd century. Then other epistles attributed to Paul, like 1st and 2nd Timothy. And then not until later, the book of Revelation, which almost didn't make it in for some reasons, similar, not to Esther, but the Song of Songs. But the early Christians had a problem with the authorship. They weren't sure that St. John wrote Revelation. And so for that reason, as well as its violent imagery, the book almost didn't make it in and wasn't totally accepted even in the East until the 5th century, even after, in one quadrant of the church, after Athanasius's letter. All right, so we have the canon lists that exclude it. We also know that not a single Christian commentary was written on it for the first 7 centuries of the Common Era. Now that's pretty staggering to think about. The fact that Esther was not even deemed worthy of a single commentary. This was a fairly common style of writing among theologians and church fathers. They would do what many pastors and Protestant theologians do today, and that is write commentaries on various books of the Bible. Not a single one was written until the 7th century on Esther. Fast forward to Martin Luther, and you all know, at least if you were able to join us last week, Luther's attitude. Did he like it?
No,
not at all. He said that he wished the book had never been written, and he had serious problems with the text. So we'll come back to Luther in particular in a moment. Finally, modern biblical scholars in the West, influenced by Martin Luther, continued to dismiss the book up through the middle of the 20th century. There was a commentary published in 1962 called Peake's Commentary on the Bible, and the author who wrote about Esther said the only thing Esther has of any worth is to show us a picture of unredeemed humanity. So again, we're talking about a rather negative assessment of this book, which just stacks up one after the other. What is it about this text that is so offensive that not only would early Christians reject it and early Jews, but also the father of the Protestant Reformation and subsequent biblical commentators in the West? What is going on here? Why are these perspectives so negative in their assessment of Esther? Now, here's what I'd like to ask you to help me with. We summarized this in our last class. We also talked before about that, as I said, the plot in the first session. Critics here are responding to passages in the text, as well as one thing left out. So what were they rejecting Esther for? Why was this book almost banned from the Bible? What do you remember?
Doesn't mention God.
Yeah, that's the big one. So that's where we're going in today's discussion, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But it doesn't mention God. The view is that the Greek edition of Esther included a number of references not only to the prayers of Mordecai and Esther, but also to God as such, to make it more theologically acceptable to its audience. So the Greek edition is good evidence for that theory, that because it doesn't mention God, or because it's godless, as Martin Luther put it, it had a tough time making it into the Bible. What else do you remember? What are other reasons?
The not married, the harem, and
the
non-traditional situation there.
Absolutely. So Martin Luther rejecting the book of Esther, among others, because of its so-called pagan naughtiness. Pagan naughtiness. And Luther is referring here, which I love, Luther is referring here to the passage in Esther chapter 2, where Esther belongs to the king's harem, and the harem pleases the king. So we can guess from that there was a lot of naughtiness involved, and because it was out of wedlock, Martin Luther had a problem with that as well. So it's godlessness, it's morals. Let's add to that a few more. It's violence. So in Esther chapter 9, verse 5, we read about how the Jews slaughtered their enemies, men, women, and children. And this made not only, I think Jackie mentioned this last week, not only Christians uneasy about the text, and in some ways hypocritical, but also the early rabbis. Violence was a factor. And this was, again, one of the reasons why the book of Revelation almost didn't make it into the Bible. And some of us, sometimes, myself included, wish it hadn't. Purim. So Purim, which is mentioned a couple times in the text, the whole story is perhaps written for the sake of explaining how Purim began, its origin. Purim was considered by some a festival of abandon, where anything goes. And so for that reason, for example, the Essenes may have rejected it. We already talked about sexual immorality. What else?
It had a female protagonist.
That's exactly right. So thanks, Lisa. A female protagonist. Purim, according to 2 Maccabees 15:36, was the day of Mordecai, not of Esther. And that may have been emphasized because of the fact that people were challenging the text on this basis. It was also considered, or Mordecai rather, was also considered the real hero of the story, even though it's quite clear to me that Esther is the real hero. So you have a number of attempts here to sort of turn the text into a patriarchal one because of the possibility that people were uneasy with a female protagonist, a strong female character like Queen Vashti. We also know from the artwork we looked at a couple weeks ago that even that tries to hide the fact, tries to minimize Esther's role. In the last chapter, or second to last chapter of the book, chapter 9, we're told that Esther and Mordecai wrote the story, yet in subsequent Western Christian art, it's Mordecai who has the pen and Esther who looms over him, or rather in the background, presumably offering elements of the story but not writing them down. So whether it's Western art, whether it's the holiday of Purim itself, or tradition broadly speaking, what we have here is an attempt almost to cover up the role of a female protagonist who herself is responsible for saving the Persian Jews from genocide. That's a pretty big deal. And thanks to feminist biblical scholars today, that's been brought to the fore. Possibly the biggest reason Esther was challenged is the one that Jackie mentioned a few moments ago, and that is that it never refers to God. So we're going to look now at this issue in particular, and it's here that I want to provide with you, or for you, the secrets that unveil a theological or religious reading of Esther. What I want to talk about to summarize up the discussion we've just had is this quote from Martin Luther. basically what Luther says is that he was he didn't want it in the Bible. He didn't like the fact that it contained what he calls in this translation heathen unnaturalities. But Luther also didn't like it because he considered it godless, and because of the fact that he felt that the attitude the author takes and the events that unfold are quite non-Jewish, or they're anti-Gentile. And Luther was uneasy with that. And as we know, eventually Luther went in the wrong direction on that issue. And it's already evident in his remarks on Esther. So we have Luther who summarizes this attitude. The question again for us is whether Esther is truly godless. My conviction is that if you can demonstrate a religious reading of Esther and show that this text is really talking about God, you have ample reason for its full inclusion in the canon, not only at the periphery, which is where it's been for the last 2,000 years, but really at the center for reasons that I'll share with you at the end of our discussion. So we've now reconstructed and given reasons for why the book was so negatively viewed. Our question is, how might the text have alluded here to God? So what I'm after in this part of our discussion is a religious reading of Esther, one that emphasizes God's involvement behind the scenes, and in doing so shows us how we can unveil the secrets of this religious reading. So let's talk about the story itself. Do you recall anything from our initial discussion or your own reading that would amount to evidence for God somehow involved in the story? Yeah, Jennifer.
I guess you could think, if we are made in the image of God and we are going to do the right thing by saving the Jews, then it could kind of, I'm thinking like God could be working through Esther to do the right thing, to possibly be killed by the king, to go ask him for help.
Yeah.
Kind of indirectly, maybe.
Yeah, does everybody hear the point? I think that's a great one. So it could well be that God is working through Esther to bring about the deliverance of her people. And the question is, where does that occur? What evidence do we have for that? And I think we actually have pretty ample evidence. You just have to know what to look for. So this is how I read it, the story. I think that you can make a definite case for the point that you just made, Jennifer, that God is somehow working through Esther, and that working through becomes most obvious when Esther has what some commentators call her conversion at the middle of the story. Martin Luther incidentally argued that conversion was a miracle, that it was evidence of the Holy Spirit turning us from ourselves back to God and neighbor. And so I think if you take Luther and read Luther against Luther, you could argue here that God is involved in that very point as well with regard to Esther. When Esther no longer thinks simply of herself and her own well-being, but rather sacrifices or potentially sacrifices her well-being for the sake of her people. That conversion could be perhaps some of the best evidence we have for God's involvement in the story. So well done. Much appreciated. That's really good. What I want to do, though, yes, Jackie, go ahead.
Well, I was reading this in the Lutheran Study Bible this week, and what I didn't realize before is it says that when it's talking about Haman, and he's the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, that he's descended from the Amalekites that had attacked the Jews as they left Egypt and were finally destroyed by Saul, and that Mordecai is one of Saul's descendants. So that's what this says. was a Jew, and it talks about he's a son of Kish, a Benjamite.
Yep.
But I guess my thought was that this is kind of continuing this story of peoples being against the Jewish people, and whether the Jews are going to survive and even conquer against them. That it kind of continues that thread of God's people.
Yeah, and I think that's it exactly. So you have, if you situate Esther in terms of a much longer history of the Israelites and their deliverance, this is actually one of the reasons that medieval commentators justified the inclusion of the inclusion of Esther in the canon, was that they looked at it as part of this much larger arc of salvation history in the Jewish tradition. And so for that reason, argued that it had a place in Scripture, even though it doesn't specifically mention God. So it's neat to hear that you ripped that up. My understanding is that Haman was descendant of the Canaanites. And so, yeah, you have this long history there. And if you situate Esther in that longer history, again, it helped make the case, according to folks in the Middle Ages, for its inclusion in the canon as well. So excellent. That's excellent. What I'm going to suggest today is that if you read it in terms of that broader history, all kinds of clues start to show up. So we'll move in that direction in a moment. Nancy?
I've thought a lot about this because I think it's complicated and sort of contradictory to our traditional ways of believing in faith. But I do believe that Esther is an example of faith. That the fact that she would not consider herself, but took her faith to make her courage. I would, I guess, also say that of Mordecai, because he was at risk. There's definitely these tensions in the court, the different political factions, the Jews, the non-Jews. And then also, as you know, I brought this up several times, the king's decision to reverse his edict, I thought was very interesting. Why did he do that? He was the king. He had already made an edict. Right. And yet, because of Esther, I think, I don't know, this is my conclusion, I have no idea, I'm not a scholar, but, I just, again, felt that was God interceding somehow through Esther, again, about faith or love, or both.
Well, to pick up on your second point there, what scholars are going to point to is a scene that occurs just before that, before the king reverses the edict, that sets things in motion. It's a coincidence. And what they're going to claim is that you have coincidences in the story that suggest sort of the hidden hand of God operative throughout. So there is a reason in the narrative for why the king changes his mind on this, or at least reverses the edict. And we'll come to that in a moment. So I think you've really hit on something there. And I think that the text gives us information that helps answer that question. Absolutely. Let's go to additional clues. And what I want to do is take you through a list of them that go, I think, from obvious to least obvious. And the first of those is this. And again, what we're doing here is we're moving toward a religious reading of Esther, arguing that God's involvement is there but behind the scenes. And the first argument that scholars will make is that there are two references in this story to an explicitly religious act. Do you know what it is? When Mordecai learns that his actions, his refusal to bow to Haman in chapter 3, that's the incident that sets off the story, really, he does something. And when Esther decides that she is going to risk her life to save her people, she asks for something. Do you know what that something is? They fast.
Clothing.
They fast.
Oh, fat. Okay.
Yeah, it's fasting.
penance thing. But
So you have fasting first in Esther 4:1-3 on the part of Mordecai, and then you have a request for intercessory fasting on the part of Esther in 4:16. And so the question here is, what's the purpose of fasting?
To cleanse,
To cleanse for what purpose?
so that they can be ready to,
So that they can be ready for what?
for whatever's going to happen.
That's pretty good. All right, I think you're right that there can be a kind of cleansing here. I guess the question would be, and that's an audio, so I don't know who.
This
Who
is
is that?
Joan.
Okay, all right. So the question here is, why fast? So to cleanse oneself, but really,
To open up your mind.
okay, open up your mind, or to what or whom?
God,
To God, right? So you
if you're gonna
fast,
die, you gotta go to
right? There's when you abstain from food, the fasting in the Old Testament typically kind of has a quid pro quo, a this for that, right? So if I abstain from food and go without, the idea is I will gain or incur God's favor, right? So the Israelites, for example, in the book of Judges will fast before they go into battle. The idea is by giving something up, God gives you something in return, right? And so the question here would be, why would Esther request a fast, and before whom, if not before God, in the hope of gaining something in return? So what we have is intercessory fasting, at least a request for it, and intercessory fasting makes no sense in a universe devoid of God, right? So the most obvious clue in the whole story is the reference to fasting. The idea being that if you give up something, and we still think this way sometimes, if you give up something, God will give you something in return. We have an example of this in the book of Jonah, where the Ninevites, you recall the story, the Ninevites are told by Jonah, the reluctant prophet, that God is going to punish them, destroy them. And what do? The king immediately calls for a fast. And that is to regain, in this case, God's favor, or to gain God's favor. So fasting serves a clearly religious purpose, and it's often the clue that is most cited when it comes to a religious reading of this story. That's number one. Number two, and this goes to Nancy's point, coincidences. We have several of them in the story, and a lot of commentators will appeal to this to argue for a kind of God working behind the scenes, setting up certain coincidences that make the deliverance of the Jews possible. Now, here's my question to all of you. What coincidence happens that enables the king to discover what Mordecai did for him? That is, you recall from the story that Mordecai is the one who reveals to Esther the assassination plot on the king's life. And what the king does is he credits that to Haman, when in fact it was Mordecai who did this. In chapter 6 of the story, the king happens to discover that Mordecai did this. How does that occur? Do you remember?
Mm-hmm.
How so, Jennifer?
He was reading, I forget why he did it, wasn't he? He just had some time to kill and...
A little more than that. He had insomnia.
Sleep.
Oh, okay,
Sleep.
insomnia. So he got his records out.
He
and
was doom
summoned-
scrolling, Jennifer. He was
Huh?
doom scrolling. He was
Doom scrolling, yeah.
He was what?
Doom scrolling.
Doom scrolling. I love
Yeah,
it.
through his records and seeing what kind of things had been going on and reading. And then he saw the day that Mordecai had come to Haman.
Right.
And then realized that, wait, it wasn't Haman that suggested it. It was Mordecai. And then he figured out how Haman was really not a nice person and
Right. Yeah.
not, good guy.
Absolutely. So it's that coincidence that the king has insomnia, and so he doom scrolls. I love that. Yeah. He doom scrolls. I mean, we all do this sometimes. If you can't sleep, you read. to help yourself get to sleep. And so he goes through the court records because, of course, there's nothing that would put you to sleep more than reading the court records, right? This king needs a library, but all he's got are court records. So he goes through the court records and he discovers that Mordecai was the one, in fact, who revealed the assassination plot. And it's because of that Mordecai then rises to power in the king's court. So that coincidence is one. The other coincidence that's big is Esther's rise to power. Here it is the case that you have Esther ascend to power just as the Jews are at their worst moment in Persian history here. Now, I want you to look at this in terms of the broader perspective. This is the same God, presumably, who splits the Red Sea, the same God who thunders from heaven, the same God who consumes the Canaanite altar to Baal with fire from heaven. The mighty and majestic acts of God earlier in the story, or earlier in the story of God and Israel, have, as it were, become much more subtle. So that now the mighty act of God is the king's insomnia. The argument here is that these coincidences are quite subtle, but they're not natural. They're too much to suggest that it's simply random events. And so even though it's a lot more subtle, the argument is that these coincidences, again, help us detect the hidden role of God in the story. The next one is Majestic Reversals. Majestic Reversals. So we have precedent for a majestic reversal already in the Bible. I was thinking about this. It's in the story of Joseph, right? So you may remember the story of Joseph where things go really bad for Joseph. His brothers basically sell him into slavery. He goes to Egypt, but everything gets reversed such that by the end of the story, it's because of Joseph's mercy that his brothers are given food in the midst of a famine, and he saves them. So this kind of majestic reversal is part of the narrative tradition, and of course we have it in the story of Esther. Probably the best example of this is what happens to Haman. So what happens to him? In the beginning, he rises to power. He takes credit for an act that he didn't commit. But what happens to him after the king discovers the truth via doom scrolling?
Yeah, he gets hung on the gallows that he had built for Mordecai.
That's exactly right. So he gets hung on the gallows that he had built for Mordecai. So there's a stark reversal here, and the second half of the story implements that reversal. So we have reversals, coincidences, references to fasting. Now, again, the question would be, how do we know that these are clues? And the answer that I discovered in studying Esther is that they appear elsewhere in Scripture where God is explicitly mentioned. Where God is explicitly mentioned. So what happens if we take these reversals, these coincidences, and we put them in Esther, but we simply remove the references to God? We have a story, ladies and gentlemen, written in code. It's written in code. You have to know the narrative tradition to decode this text. And that was my big lesson in reading it, to use a popular and well-worn phrase: you have to let Scripture interpret Scripture. And here's where I discovered the juiciest clues in the story. And that's with respect to a fourth category of clues. So again, fasting was the first, coincidences was the second, reversals was the third, and these have precedent in prior Hebraic tradition. The fourth is allusions, and that's really what caught my attention in reading this story. The most important cluster of which is Esther 4:14-16. So Mordecai says to Esther in 4:14, "For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance," now deliverance is another word I would highlight, deliverance, "will rise for the Jews from another quarter. but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. So I kind of see this as a cluster of clues right in the middle of the story. And just for the sake of review, can anybody tell us where this occurred? What's happening in the story when Mordecai says this? Remember?
Yeah, well, she's trying to decide, isn't she been challenged to go talk to the king, and she's trying to decide whether she will or not.
That's exactly right. So this is the moment in the story where Mordecai pleads to her through messengers that she must speak to the king on behalf of her people so that they won't be destroyed by this edict. And why is the decision again so difficult for Esther?
Because if he doesn't receive her and allow her to approach him, she could be killed.
That's correct. So the custom of the king, of the court rather, is that you can only speak before the king if you are summoned. And so if you are not, and if you speak to him and the king doesn't want to hear you, then you can be executed. So this is really a life or death question for Esther. And it's at this moment that I think the story is at the highest pitch. This is the moment of climax in the 5 basic elements of plot, where everything hinges on Esther's decision. And what we see here is a conversion, essentially. Esther decides to respond favorably, and it's because of her decision. She says, if I perish, I perish, and then she requests the fast, that the Jews ultimately are saved. So all of this hangs on Esther, and she delivers. But it's that word delivers that I think is the first important clue here. So let's take a look at the text. For if you keep silent at such a time as this, relief and deliverance. Now, again, I want you to think of what I was talking about earlier with respect to Jackie's comment about the long history, the long narrative history of the Jewish people. When you hear the word deliverance, what comes to mind in the Old Testament?
Moses.
Moses, all right.
Exodus.
Exactly, that's exactly right. So we're talking about easily the most important story of liberation before the exile in Jewish history. And that is the liberation of the Jews, their deliverance from the Egyptians thanks to Moses. So that word deliverance, now imagine you are a Jew in Persia. You are living under the iron fist of foreign rule. When you hear a story like this, without any reference to God, immediately your ears are going to perk up. You're going to recognize this code, even in a word like deliverance, insofar as it alludes to the story of deliverance, the paradigmatic story of deliverance in the book of Exodus. So Moses and Exodus is exactly correct. All right. Now, again, imagine yourself as a Persian Jew hearing this story. You've now heard the word deliverance, and then you hear this, will rise for the Jews from another quarter. Now, this is really quite possibly the most explicit reference to God we have in the whole text, from another quarter. We don't have precedent for it, however, in the Hebrew canon, which is really interesting. But it figures prominently here. Deliverance will arise from another quarter, another place, another location. Now, what do we make of this? If you want to read Esther through a secular lens, there are all kinds of possibilities. Another quarter could be Persian Jews who are about to incite a rebellion. That's a secular reading. Another quarter could be Persians of conscience within the empire who are aware of what's happening or about to happen to the Jews, and because of that reason, revolt. It could be a reference to Rome. There are some scholars who argue that Esther was actually written much later than the time at which it was set, and that this is a reference to Rome. We know in the book of Maccabees that Rome helped or promised to help Judah be delivered from the Seleucids. The Seleucids were under the reign of Antiochus IV, were demanding that the Jews worship foreign gods in their temple. So it could be a reference to Rome. It could be a reference to any of these. It could also be a reference to God, relief from another quarter. And what I'm going to suggest is that it could be a reference to God because of other clues in this passage. So let's take a look now at these additional or remaining clues. So we have another quarter, and then you and your father's family will perish. So again, father's family, why is that highlighted? Because the phrase appears more than half a dozen other times in the Old Testament before Esther was written. And when it does, it refers to a threat coming from God. So King David, for example, asks God in 2 Samuel to punish in his father's house for the sins he committed rather than punishing all of Israel. And so when there is reference to father's house, it is often in the Hebrew Bible associated explicitly with God. Only in the book of Esther is it not. So the question here is, or the observation here would be that this is another clue that God is somehow involved, the language of father's house. The one that I find most intriguing is who knows. Now, a secular reading would say, and this is what I initially favored, that when Mordecai says this, it's just sort of like, who knows? Who knows what could happen here, right? That he's indifferent, that he's skeptical even. But who knows appears roughly 10 times in the Hebrew Bible, and it often occurs before a reference to God. So if you go to the book of Jonah again, chapter 3, the king says, if we fast and repent of our sins, God may be merciful. Who knows? Right? So it usually precedes the expectation of divine mercy. That if we fast, we see this with King David as well. If we fast, who knows? God might deliver us, right? So this is where it gets really fascinating. You've got deliverance. You've got reference to father's house or family. You also have this talk of who knows, which is not, I would argue, ordinary skepticism, but interpreted within the broader, long history of the Israelites and their relationship with God is code language. Whenever we see the word or phrase who knows, it typically precedes the expectation that if we do X, God will do Y. God will save us or deliver us. So for these reasons, as well as the reference to fasting, as well as this last piece right here, perhaps you will have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. You see what Mordecai's doing there? For just such a time as this? He seems to be indicating that there's a right time for something, that some kind of unseen force could be putting factors together. By the way, who knows? Another important reference to that is in the book of our favorite minor prophet, Joel. In the book of Joel, chapter 2, there's a reference to fasting as a way to stave off divine punishment. And then the expectation is preceded by the question, who knows? Again, now Joel's really tricky, as we learned from our own Joel some time back to date. But if you assume that Joel was contemporary or before Esther, again, we have intertextual evidence for this religious reading. So Mordecai's reference to just such a time as this, and then finally Esther's reference to fasting accomplishes the following. I think it provides for a quite persuasive reading of this text theologically. So let's, you have who knows, father's house, deliverance, and then a reference to another quarter, help coming from there. And then you have you have this Esther changing her mind and her request for a fast. This whole constellation of what I would argue are religious clues based on other biblical texts that make it arbitrary then to say, okay, another quarter is simply a reference to a secular reason for their liberation, like say the Roman Empire. It makes more sense to interpret another quarter theologically given this constellation of clues surrounding it. And what I would suggest there is that it could well be that God would work through not only Esther, but if Esther decides not to comply with God's will, that God would find another human or group of people to deliver the Jews in place of Esther. So these two aren't mutually exclusive. We find this, hear this a lot in the Hebrew Bible, that God works through various groups to bring about whatever God's will is in that situation. What I love about this is that it gives Esther so much autonomy that if she decided not to comply with God, she would have actually thwarted God's immediate plan in that moment, such that God would have to choose an alternative to bring about the ultimate goal of deliverance for the Jews. All right, questions? Jennifer.
So in the last line of that passage, he says, maybe you were here in this position to save them. But has anybody ever argued that, well, if she hadn't been sent to court to begin with to the king, the Jews wouldn't have been in peril, at least this time. Mordecai wouldn't have been there to not bow to Haman. And so,
yeah,
I don't know, the whole thing's a wash, but.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it could have been that the Jews were already in jeopardy and that Mordecai was simply the match that lit the fire that was already ready to burn, for lack of a better metaphor. So that could be it. But yeah, I think you make a good point that if it wasn't for Esther's ascendancy in the first place, none of this would have happened. You could also probably argue that it was that God makes that happen so that foreseeing that Mordecai, I don't know. It gets pretty tricky there to argue, but here's my question. Or it just would have been
someone else.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I find, again, so fascinating, is that the theological assumption we might bring to a story like this is that everything happens according to God's will. And I said might, not all of us, but that everything happens according to God's will. And yet what you have in the story is a human being who is in the position, potentially, of thwarting God's will, forcing God, as it were, to recalibrate. To find another source of liberation for the deliverance of God's people. It does say in the text once that the Jews are, what's the word? That they are indestructible. There is also reference into the text, I forgot to point this out earlier, we have what are called divine passives, two moments in the text where the reversal of the Jews' fortune is hinted God is hinted at in these moments when it says their lot was basically changed or turned. It doesn't say who did it. But my thinking is that if you really analyze the way we just did here, Esther 4:14, what you have is this kind of shining jewel in the text that opens up a theological reading, and you can do that by way of these literary clues that are concentrated here, but really sprinkled throughout the text. I think it opens it up. Now, here's my last question for all of you. If you find the religious reading of Esther plausible, and it's really an intertextual reading that looks at clues based upon the way these phrases are used elsewhere in the Old Testament, if you find that kind of reading plausible, and acknowledge the possibility that this text is really talking about God as a kind of hidden or unseen force waiting in the wings, subtly operating throughout the story to bring about the deliverance of the Jews, why do you think there was no direct reference to God? What could be happening here? Yeah, Susan.
Was there something going on at the time that Esther was written that would lead to things being written, quote unquote, in code, similar to the language that's used in Revelation?
Were the Jews possibly being persecuted?
Mm-hmm.
And for that reason, needed to be quiet when it came to their religious beliefs? Yeah, I think that's a totally plausible reading. And I love going back to the context and trying to imagine what the circumstances would have been such that this author writes a story in code without referencing God, even though the folks to whom this author is speaking are going to pick it up easily because of the literary tradition. Yes, so it's possible that they could have been experiencing duress under foreign rule, and that to avoid, and this one's for Colin, any imperial entanglements, they wrote in code to evade further persecution. That's a reference to a Star Wars line. So that's one possibility, Susan, and I think it's a good one. Another one, how many of you have ever attended a Purim celebration? Okay, another one could have been that that the author wanted to make sure that God was not mentioned during a festival where anything goes, right? Where people are drinking, they're celebrating, and may well be reading the story drunk. Now, there is some textual evidence in Jewish tradition that the lector is not supposed to be drinking before he or she reads the text, but that doesn't necessarily mean that in practice it always worked out that way. And so perhaps, according to one Jewish commentator, the term God was left out of the story so that during Purim it wouldn't be uttered blasphemously by someone drunk, which I think is fascinating. So the idea would be that the Jews appropriated the story from the Babylonians and turned it into an explanation for why we celebrate Purim, but without reference to God, so that the lector would not potentially utter blasphemies, speaking the holy name of God while completely hammered. That's one. Another one, let me just get through the two more, Nancy, and then I'll close up with a few final questions here. Another one could have been, and this was a dominant view in the Middle Ages, the concern that Persians would take over the story that the Jews had appropriated and commit blasphemy by substituting their God with the Hebrew God. So the way to prevent that would be to simply avoid referencing the Hebrew God and give people clues so that they know that the story is really about God and God delivering the Jews, even though God is never mentioned. A third, and this is my personal favorite because I think it has the most relevance for us, especially in the post-religious Pacific Northwest. It could well be, according to the Fortress Commentary on the Old Testament, that the author is reflecting the religious experience or lack thereof of his or her contemporaries, namely diaspora Jews who had been scattered and were now living apart from their homeland, apart from the temple, apart from their brethren, scattered, living under the duress of foreign rule, that their religious experience could have been one of God's absence. And there's a Jewish author who says that Esther is writing in a post-revelation world. And he points out that this world in many ways mirrors, or rather anticipates, the secular West. And so what we have here is a story of how God can be subtly at work in our lives, even when, and especially when, we think that God is absent. And you can't get a better theology of the cross than that. The whole teaching is that from Martin Luther, is that God is hidden, especially in suffering and in places where we don't expect God to be. So you could argue that this really is a testament to God's unseen presence in our lives, even when we don't believe that God is really there, which I think makes Esther especially relevant for us today. All right, Nancy, others, questions?
Well, actually, you just said what I was going to comment on, which is, to me, this reads like a very human story of the age that these people were living in. and how they were led, which reflects my own human story, well, I think I've mentioned before in this group, I feel I know when I'm led almost in hindsight. It's not like I see it coming. And so that's how I'm reading this story is, yes, these people were there and there was all this barbaric stuff going on that went on in these ages, but they are being led. And but you just said it much better, Pastor.
Well, I mean, no, I agree with you that they're being led. And again, you just have to look at these clues, I think, and really know the literary tradition to be able to make sense of it in a way that would have been easy for folks who were living in this tradition at the time. And I mean, I think the other relevance here, of course, is that this is a story of attempted genocide against ethnic Jews. These were not observant Jews. It's one of the reasons, I think, why Luther had, not Luther maybe, but others had a problem here. We have no evidence in the text to suggest that they observed kosher dietary restrictions, for example. So they were ethnic Jews. And what one commentator points out is that in many ways, the Holocaust makes this story all the more real. Because it's the story of how the Jews narrowly evaded genocide throughout Persia. And Persia, at least according to the author, had quite an expansive empire. There were 128 provinces from India to Nubia, from India to Ethiopia. And so to imagine the eradication of an entire group of people in a vast empire like that, and how it all hangs on the decision of a single person to narrowly evade it, it's a really harrowing story to read on the other side of the Holocaust. Yeah. So, and it's really, I mean, one of the other points that commentators note is that it's really a testimony to the Jews and the kind of self-reliance necessary to survive in a foreign land like this, separated from their homeland. So it's a testimony to how a people utilize their own resources, nudged perhaps by God, but nevertheless used their own resources to survive. And that has been the story of the Jews throughout the ages in many ways. Yeah. Nancy, one more and then we'll close.
Just one short point. I have read where Esther and Mordecai are buried in Iran, in Hamadan, which I find pretty fascinating, I guess, because they lived in Persia. But I think that's kind of interesting to look at. Yeah.
And this is not on Esther and Mordecai per se, but it's on the Purim festival itself. One of my favorite readings of this story points out that you have all these excesses, right? That the 128 provinces, even though Herodotus, the Greek historian, says that Xerxes I ruled over a relatively modest 20, the 500-day drink fest, the fact that Haman is executed on a pole that is 50 cubits high, which would have been about 75 feet. You have all these excesses in the story, which for this commentator, his name is Edward Greenstein, makes it clear that it's written expressly for the purpose of Purim, where you have exaggeration and you enter a different world and anything goes. And so he basically says, from a Jewish perspective, no wonder God is never mentioned. You have this kind of celebration going on. You can't risk saying the deity's name in a blasphemous way. You can also see why maybe the Essenes had such a problem with it. Who wants this kind of celebration? No, that's for the Messianic era. It's not for ours. So that is incidentally why Maimonides, the great medieval Jewish philosopher, said that Esther belonged at the center of the canon because it alone anticipated the mood of the Messianic era to come. Insofar as it stipulates in chapter 9 to celebrate without ceasing, which I think is a great and often overlooked commandment in the Hebrew Bible. All right, probably a good note to end on, celebrate, especially as we near in this challenging time the birth of Christ and hopefully a new beginning with a vaccine in the coming year. So our next forum will be in January.
according to the forum schedule, January 10th, God Talk number 3, the providence of God.
Yeah, which is perfect because it's this talk of providence in the book of Esther that'll set up a much fuller discussion of that theological topic in January. So please join us for that. It's great to see all of you. And if I don't see you at coffee hour, I wish you a very Merry Christmas and happy remainder of Advent. So thanks for being with us. Take care.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Thank you.
New Year.